Well, we're here today for our finale of season 7. It's very exciting. We've just covered the book Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood by Gretchen Sisson. I think I'm saying it right. You can correct us. So welcome. We've been looking forward to this and taking the time to speak with you. We do want our listeners to know, because not everybody's read the book, that this is about modern relinquishment, mothers who have given up babies from 2020 to 2000 to 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. So welcome. We're excited to have you here.
No, I'm
Yeah, thanks
really,
for being here. Really,
yeah.
it's
Of
been a
course.
ride with this book, I'll tell
Oh,
you.
yeah.
Very,
Well, I am really excited to be here and get to chat with you both. And I'm so appreciative of you all for reading the book so carefully. And I've enjoyed listening along and hearing your thoughts and the conversations that you're having with other adoptees around just
Thank you for
the world.
listening.
So I appreciate
Thank
most of probably you hear me being mad a lot.
that.
Just seems to be my normal state when I read these books. And
it's
Well,
heavy.
When you feel anger about something, it's always helps you feel like more righteously indignant when you're in good company. So,
Yes. I
yes,
like that. Yeah, it's true.
yeah. So Gretchen, your book is entitled Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of
Mm.
American Motherhood. What did you mean when you chose that title? I mean, we can guess after reading it, and we might be correct, but what was your thinking and your conclusion about that title?
yeah, I mean, the real answer is that when you try to figure out a subtitle for a complicated book, there were like 12 words that we moved around in any number of different orders. And I wanted it to say something about privilege or power in there. Obviously, need to say adoption. The question was it American motherhood or American adoption? Is it about, and at the end of the day, this is the title that we came up with. But the privilege piece was important to be in there because I think that this is really about how systems of power shape the experience
Yeah.
of motherhood, not just for relinquishing mothers and or adoptive mothers, but really for everyone. People who aren't impacted directly by adoption or who may or may not be at risk for family separation within private adoption systems are still impacted by the same ideas of motherhood. Who gets to be a mother? Who do we support in their parenting journey? Whose parenthood is policed? Who is scrutinized to a greater degree? And that's why I think that these questions that are reflected by relinquishment and by adoption actually impact far, far more mothers and families more broadly. And so I wanted to have something that conveyed that this was a broader examination of what privilege and parenting looks like in the United States, even for those who aren't directly impacted, using those who are impacted to understand how these systems are working.
I like the title privilege. It made me even think of my own parenting, my own motherhood. Like, it is a privilege. It is something that I got to do because of this. And we found out, how did you come to this? You're a sociologist. What made you say, I want to write about this? What was the background for that?
Yeah. Well, I always say I started doing the work for this book far before I knew that I was writing a book on this
Okay.
topic. So when I started doing the data collection in 2010, I was just trying to finish my dissertation. And as I put in the book, I was working with an organization that worked with young parents, so pregnant and parenting teenagers. Um, and I was looking at the ways that their motherhood was so stigmatized and marginalized and not supported. And that to me was really inspiring to see all of the work that they were putting in to just advocating for themselves, their children, just the basic levels of supports that they needed from people. Um, and my work kind of throughout at that point and then throughout my career has been looking at the gap between these cultural and political narratives that we have around an experience and what the experience actually looks like. So what are these stories that we tell ourselves about what teen motherhood looks like versus the actual experience of teen motherhood? Who is impacted, what it means for their lives and their children's lives? The stories that we tell about abortion, right? What is what do we believe to be true about abortion? What is the misinformation and the social myth making around that versus the actual lived experiences for people who need to access abortion care? And that was part of what drove my initial interest in looking at adoption, was understanding these cultural and political ideas that we have about adoption, what it means, who it serves, how it impacts people, and then wanting to understand what that lived experience looked like. And initially, when I did that data collection, I didn't have a time limit on when the adoptions were that I was collecting data from. So I interviewed a lot of baby scoop era birth mothers, kind of going back to the 60s. And of course, found out that they are in a very, very critical place of understanding their adoptions and what happened to them because they went through these like deeply coercive, secretive adoptions. Um, some of the mothers that I interviewed whose adoptions were more recent at the time, so this was like between 2005, 2009, some of them were in a much more optimistic place around their adoptions and understanding what had happened to them. And were really hopeful that adoption would serve them and their child well over the course of their lives. And so the question then, as a researcher, became, has adoption gotten better? Right? Are the women in more recent adoptions feeling better about it because it is meaningfully better? Is the system changed enough that we are actually serving people more effectively through this practice? Or does everyone kind of come to a more critical place over time? So is it the historical timeline of how adoption has changed, or the personal timeline of how people feel about their own adoption as time goes by? And the only way to really answer that was to re-interview the same group of women 10 years later and see how their feelings had
That
evolved.
was very, very powerful.
Yes,
Yeah.
very.
And I think that was really what gave the book, I mean, two things gave the book the final shape that it has. One was the 10-year follow-up data, where almost all of the mothers, even those who had been in that like very hopeful place when I first interviewed them, were struggling much more. Because the systems just aren't set up to provide long-term support. And they had a much more critical understanding of what had happened to them, the circumstances that led to the adoption, and what adoption meant for them and their child. That was the first piece. And then the second piece was the Dobbs oral arguments and the Dobbs decision, because I have always come to this work from a place, from a lens of reproductive justice, right? And wanting to understand the ways that adoption was kind of used and misused within a broader conversations about reproductive autonomy and justice. And so when the Dobbs oral arguments happened, and Justice Coney Barrett keeps bringing up this idea that women don't need access to abortion care because they can just terminate their parental rights, that was really what gave it a political lens. I mean, my work has always had a political lens, but it elevated that for other people. So people who have never thought about adoption as a political issue were ready to look at it that way. People who have never questioned kind of the conservative underpinnings of what adoption is, started to be like, oh, that's a weird way of thinking about it. Like, let me probe that a little bit more. And so it kind of gave, because I do think that we're at a moment where people are ready for this conversation, and I'm really glad that this book can be part of that conversation. But this is happening in the zeitgeist more broadly, and so I feel grateful that this book and my data could kind of speak to this moment that we are in, and that was what gave this book its final form.
The Dobbs decision, do you think played a big part in kind of elevating the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it just would have been a very different book. I mean, I still would have written a book, but it probably would have been like I had written an academic book proposal that had tables and charts and really long methodology section, right? And I think that what the Dobbs decision did, both the oral arguments and then the final decision that Alito wrote with the domestic supply of infants line, right? it just changed who the audience was going to be able to be for this book. So what could have been like a more niche academic analysis, I mean, it's still pretty much an academic analysis, but it was written for not necessarily a classroom reader, right? It's written for a general audience.
Well, that sort of goes along, as you know, our podcast is for adoptees mainly. We do welcome anybody to listen to learn about adoptees, but it's become a big book among adoptees, which maybe wouldn't have been the case. It would have been lost in the shuffle. Our podcast kind of came to light through this time period as well. So for us, I mean, you're not an adoptee, I'm assuming. And I actually think that gives it a greater boost for people to learn, because we're sort of in that vortex where, if you're angry or you're an adoptee, or even if you've had a good adoption and you want to talk about it, oh, well, that's because of this. And I know but this is because you're not
It's
an adoptee.
subjective.
It's,
We're
yes,
accused of being
scientists.
subjective
That's right.
about our experience. So it takes
Yes.
often, sometimes people like you, people like Gabrielle Glazer to kind of
Yes.
bring these issues to light that might make somebody that wouldn't listen to us maybe
Yeah.
listen to you. So it's important.
Yeah, and I feel torn about that, right? Because people should be listening to adoptees more, right?
Right.
And one thing that I was very clear, I mean, my research is obviously not on adoptee experiences, but it was important to me that the work felt accountable to adoptees, right? And I specifically was sure to cite not just adopted scholars and their own work, but memoir, and even Instagram post. Like, I think the conversations that are happening on social media with adoptee voices on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'm not young or cool enough to actually be on TikTok, but I hear that it's a happening place for the adoptee community. It was important to me to include that, because that is where the movement is happening. That's where the organizing is happening. And so to me, that felt like a benefit to be able to draw on and cite this tremendous wealth of conversation that's happening. And some folks, tell me that it is helpful that I'm not an adoptee, right? And so I'm not writing from the place of personal experience. And some people are uncomfortable with me writing about adoptee or adoption experiences not being directly impacted myself. And, I've always said all the best I can do is to make sure that my scholarship is accountable to adoptees, and that my work to be an ally in this space, speaks for itself. And I understand that discomfort that some people have. I don't think that not being impacted makes the work more or less credible, but I do know that it changes how it's perceived by people both within and outside of the community. So
I don't feel that you came across as I am an expert in adoption because I've been through adoption. I really think it was a scientific approach. And when you talk about the birth mother, it doesn't separate out the the adoptee is part of that.
Yeah.
So for us reading it, it was really eye-opening, actually, because we're from the baby scoop era, for our listeners, which is a different time for the mothers, but it's not that different. That's what we found. It's really,
That's what was so sort of re-upsetting, to just realize it's just hasn't changed, and the public narrative around adoption and the rainbows and unicorns that the public does think about adoption is still the same, and it's feels like an uphill battle a lot of the times. And so that's why I'm appreciative to you, to people who are studying it, getting the data and talking about it. I wasn't uncomfortable with it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think most adoptees who've read it don't feel that way. But I do think that there were some, and like, just skepticism, like who are you writing about this and why? Right. Or someone was like, oh, it just feels like you're profiting off of adoptees' pain. And I was like, oh, I'm not really profiting off right now.
Yeah.
But that's another issue. But
That's
no,
a whole
but I think
I know those voices.
yeah, and I again, all I can do is hope that the book resonates with people who actually have have the time and capacity
It
to.
really resonates. We're going to start season 8 with The Girls Who Went Away, Ann Fessler.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So it's kind of, we're doing the modern and then we're going back, and it's nice for our for the listeners and for the adoptees and other people who listen to hear how it is now, how it was. It isn't different. It is different. It's not different. We need to progress forward. And these are the kind of books that make that happen, really. I mean,
And I will say Ann Fessler's book was like hugely formative to me in my thinking. So that I read that book soon after it came out. So before I even started my own research. And it was absolutely like foundational to me. And that's why my book is structured the way that it is, right? With sort of the chapter of my voice. And that's why I really wanted to put in the first person accounts, the same way that Anne did in Girls Who Went Away. And I view, I just hope that my contribution can be a continuation of the conversation that she started with that book. So.
Well, speaking of why did you decide to study this issue? Like,
Yeah.
how did that come about?
like
You know, I'm,
everything. Yeah.
yeah, I think it really came from my work. Well, one, my broader work in reproductive health and justice, right? And seeing the ways that adoption was kind of continually framed as a solution, right? So I was volunteering at the abortion fund, and there was always this idea that like, oh, adoption is the meaningful alternative to abortion. I was working with these young mothers, these teen moms who were constantly told like, oh, well, you should have just given up your children, right? This would have been better for everyone, because young parenthood is so inevitably detrimental, that it would have been better if this child were being raised by a different family. I had written my master's thesis at that point on infertility, right? And the ways that couples who were struggling to conceive and trying to figure out how they wanted to build their families were just told like, oh, like adoption is so much easier. Like, why are you going through IVF? There's so many children out there in need of homes. Um, and the way that adoption was just sort of continually framed as this panacea, right? That if we just transfer children from one family to a different family, that we don't need to provide abortion access. We don't need to grapple with what infertility means and what access to infertility treatment could mean. We don't need to actually support young families or people who are trying to parent in poverty, because we've just solved that problem, right? And I think that to me was at its core such a conservative idea of what family is and could be, and what our obligation as a society is to people in helping support them and work towards autonomy and support for communities, that I wanted to probe that more deeply, because, and I'm very clear in the book, like as someone who comes from the political left, and was coming to understand adoption as an increasingly conservative institution, why has this not been examined more closely? Like, why do we consider adoption as something that is aligned with a broader progressive value system? And so that's what I wanted to see.
What also is infuriating about the messaging, oh, adoption is the solution, is that going back years and years, there is research to show the trauma to both the birth mother, to the child, that it would be better to put resources into families. This has been out there, and yet it just still remains stuck with this conservative ideology.
And I think that some of these are just political questions, right? That adoption became this really easy common ground in the abortion debate.
It's a common ground with the
and
left and the right,
yeah,
isn't
and
it?
it was like, look, we can't agree on much else, but we can agree that adoption is good and beautiful, right? And so people kind of latched onto it. And, I've talked with a lot of policymakers now across, let's not say across the political spectrum, but like from pretty moderate central to like very progressive policymakers. And what has most struck me is that they have not thought about this deeply before. And that they are not people aren't talking to them about adoption and what it looks like, right? And this is for state policymakers who are like, what do you mean people don't have access to their original birth certificates, right? To federal policymakers who are like, oh, we've never thought about the difference between public and private adoption systems when we look at subsidies. And I think that that's a reflection of like who has political power and that type of capital in our country. But it also is just a reflection of the ways that we don't question this really hegemonic narrative about adoption and who it serves.
That speaks to your word privilege, and I'm wondering. You just mentioned it a little bit ago that there isn't. People say, "Oh, there's all these babies that need homes." There really isn't all these babies that need homes. That we found out. I actually found that out through your book. I mean, I knew there was less, but you put a lot of statistics in, and I do think maybe sometimes we're even hard on all sides. Maybe it is just education. Like, I don't think people do know. I certainly didn't know several years ago any of this. So I think, what do
because
you
we
think?
were,
Yeah.
being two adoptees from the baby scoop era, we were just led to believe the whole narrative. I mean, and it's kind of a maybe a
Mhm.
safety, latching onto safety, that
Yeah.
if you examine it at all, then you're no longer
Yeah.
safe. You no longer belong with the people that raised you. It's just,
Scary.
there's a lot of layers to that, so that when you do finally, you know, we call it coming out of the fog, come out of the fog, it's super painful. And then you start examining it and you start reading books like yours. One thing that popped into my head, though, when you were talking about the political stuff, is the system of adoption is so deeply messed up and, historically corrupt. If you go back to Georgia Tan and how some of these laws changed, I've kind of compared it to Boeing sometimes. Like, it's so deeply troubled that how much unraveling it will take to change it, it's overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
If
Well,
that
and
makes sense.
people will often ask me, like, what could ethical adoption look like?
Yeah.
Or how would you adopt ethically? What would that mean today? And I think the book is fairly cynical. I actually tend to be like a fairly optimistic person about who, like, I believe that people are coming to these questions with good intentions, right? They want to be parents.
Right.
Usually they want to care for a child. They are they're wanting to care for a child, like, outside of their own family initially, like and they're coming to that place where they believe that that's an altruistic impulse, right? And that's what they want. There's nothing fundamentally wrong. There's a lot that's misinformed about those
It,
intentions, but there's nothing fundamentally unethical about that, right?
except that it's second choice, right? Their first choice would have been to have their own baby. So
I think, yeah, yes, in most cases, but I think, and I've talked to some people who work in these spaces who, like, they do get some adoption first prospective parents, right? Who believe that this is an altruistic thing that they want to do,
Okay.
that this is worth pursuing, right? So yes, most people who want to adopt would have chosen to conceive and have tried to conceive, but not all. And I think that that's actually important to talk about that, especially when you look at like religious frames for adoption, because like the
Yeah, good
evangelical
point.
church talks about adoption as like a reflection of faith, right? And so
Right.
you'll have more and more people in these faith communities who are having biological children and also adopting, right? Because they believe that adoption is an expression of their faith and a practice of their church. And um but to get back to the point where if you assume people are coming with good intentions, I don't think you can. One, I don't think good intentions count for as much as everybody wants them to. So I'm not trying to let everybody off the hook. But what I'm saying is even if you have all of these good intentions, even if that's what you're bringing, if the system is unethical, if the
Right.
Mhm.
system is premised on exploitation and predatory behaviors, and it's rooted in inequity. It's rooted in injustice. It doesn't matter what an individual person is bringing to that system. You're still participating in practices that are unjust.
Yes.
And there's no ethical way to do that. And
Mhm.
that is just what the system looks like at its core right now. That it would require a huge dismantling to want to think about other ways of caring for children that prioritize an ethical approach to care.
Yeah.
Which perhaps could be family preservation first, resources going into that.
Yeah. And some of these mothers were not as young as you would think, because I do think everyone says, oh, the teenager having the baby.
Yeah.
But many of the mothers you interviewed and that we've read about are in their 20s.
Yeah.
But they're in systems like talk about that a little bit.
So they skew a little bit younger than the average birthing population in the United States. Especially when you look at like some of the really young, there's more outliers, right? So there's disproportionately like more under 16s among relinquishing mothers. So there's definitely a skewing towards youth, but not as dramatically as you would think, right? A lot of them are in their 20s. Most relinquishing mothers today, for over the last 10 years, already have children. They're already parenting. They're relinquishing subsequent children. This is a shift, right? I know you said you're reading Girls Who Went Away next. When you look at the baby scoop era, most relinquishing mothers were young women, girls, particularly young white women and girls. And that was really essential for how adoption was practiced at the time, was that adoption was a way of delaying motherhood, right? This was a way of saying, like, you're pregnant, you're probably almost certainly not married. That's an inappropriate time to be pregnant. You're not an inappropriate mother, but it's inappropriate for you to be pregnant and parenting now. So you're going to relinquish this baby in secrecy. You're going to go back to your life. You're going to get married, and then it will be a better time for you to parent, right? And these were mostly middle-class women. And that's important because they had this trajectory by which parenting would become acceptable to them later in their life, right? Today, that is just not really what relinquishing mothers look like. There's far more women of color that are participating in private adoption. And it's really poverty and lack of capacity to parent more children that is defining who is relinquishing. So that's been a huge shift. And I actually don't, you can sort of talk about like the point in time comparisons between the baby scoop era and now. It's very different. But I actually think it's a more recent transition. Like, I think this is a transition, and we don't have good data on this, which as a researcher is deeply frustrating to me. But I think that this is a transition that happened since 2000, like in the last 25 years or so. Because up until the data that we have that goes through like the 90s, it was still so predominantly white women.
What do you account for that shift?
Yeah. A couple of things. One is that abortion access has changed and shifted. Two is that, and not just abortion access, but contraception, the ability to control whether you're giving birth or not at any point in your life is far greater than it was. Norms around single motherhood have changed a lot. That's much more acceptable. So it used to be that they only looked at adoption as a function of unmarried birth, but now there's too many non-marital births in the United States, that's no longer a meaningful way of understanding whether or not someone's going to relinquish, because so many women who are unmarried and give birth are intending to be pregnant, are intending to parent those children to a far greater degree than it was. So one, that just means that there are just fewer babies overall. And two is that there's been a real shift toward the ability to, the willingness of white adoptive parents to adopt children of color. And part of the reason why private adoption was historically so white was that there was a market demand for white children. White families were not willing to adopt children of color. So the market forces, the agencies, the attorneys didn't target women of color in the same way, but also communities of color have always had longer systems of kinship support around children and less stigma around single motherhood. Right. But as those cultural norms have all shifted over the last 40, 50 years, it's in a very different place. And poverty is now really the unifying factor. But there's also this shift towards the willingness of families to adopt children of color, or even the preference to adopt children of color in some of these religious communities. I think that was fueled by the rise and fall of international adoption throughout the 90s and early 2000s. When you look at the countries that were exporting children to the United States, right? It was a lot of Russia, Ukraine, those were white children.
Yeah.
Then a shift towards South and Central America. And then on the tail end, and I should say Asia, of course, China, Korea. And then toward the end, Africa and Haiti, right? Black children, right? And so you sort of saw this shift in even with international adoption from white children to non-white children that were marketed as being more proximate to whiteness, and then actually to Black children. And now you see just that the idea of transracial adoption is far more comfortable for families. And Elizabeth Raleigh, who's another sociologist, she wrote a book called Selling Transracial Adoption that kind of looks at this transformation.
Can I just point out that you've used the word market quite a few times, and it's a disturbing word to use in association with a baby or a child.
And I think it is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that's part of the reason why I use it, because
it is
not just to like stir shit up and make people uncomfortable, but because I think it's accurate, right? You're looking at a system that is supply and demand driven, and it's really demand driven because we have so much more demand for infants than we have infants that are available. But you have to understand this as a market-based system within a capitalist society to understand the way that it works. It's because demand is high and supply is low that you have so many of these coercive practices. It's because demand is high and supply is low that adoption is as expensive that it is. And then you have money acting as this force. And it's because it's this market system that commodifies people at its core that you have to, I mean, that is the root of what you're going to have to dismantle if you wanted to envision a more ethical way of caring for children who cannot be cared for within their family of origin.
And you spoke of the altruism of maybe the thoughtful altruism at the beginning of the process
the belief
the belief
in altruism, right? Because I don't think, I don't.
But what would your advice be? Maybe this is a question I just have listening to you.
For people who want to adopt?
Yeah, because that's still going to happen. I know, but what if you had to, is there something else you would lead them to in your opinion?
What I always say is that we always need more people to care about children, right? And there are plenty of children in our country who are in need of more care.
Yeah.
And who aren't necessarily safe within their families, who have parents who are, very deep and struggling for addiction, have parents who are incarcerated. Now, I think that those are proximate measures. Like, I also think that we need to think about, what our opioid epidemic means and how that's its own predatory system.
All different.
What our systems of incarceration mean.
Right.
That's like these are all.
It's all tied together.
It really is.
But so the long-term picture of building a more just world addresses those as well, right? But in the short term, there are children who can't be made safe and actively parented by their parents at any given moment. So what does it mean to find systems of care for them, right? Ideally, those are happening within their own extended kinship networks, within their own communities, finding ways of supporting that. But that's not always possible either, at least, again, in the short term. And so we need foster parents who don't necessarily want to adopt.
To change someone's we need
people
not change their identity and not
who aren't saying like, oh, the only type of care that I'm going to offer a child is if I have a permanent legal relationship with
Mhm.
them, but
Right.
who are willing to work towards providing crisis care, providing temporary care, actively working with a family towards reunification that will be successful in the long run, right?
Mhm.
That's a tall order. It's very different than how we think of parenting today. But if you want to be a parent, why do you want to be a parent, right? Do you
Yeah.
want to be a parent
Mhm.
because you want that identity for yourself? Okay, that's fine. I mean, like as someone who's had children, like that was important to me. I wanted to have children. But there's nothing altruistic about that if you're making it about what you want for yourself, right?
Exactly. I say this
Yes.
often.
Right. Thank
And
you.
if like if you want that, it's okay to admit that you want that, but that's about your desires. It's not about what a child needs. Um, and so I think it's about really questioning like why people want to adopt.
Mhm.
And I also think that there's a broader conversation about the piece that I think that gets lost in conversations about reform and abolition is also the conversation about infertility, right?
Right.
Infertility is deeply painful. Infertility treatments are incredibly expensive,
Yes.
right? They're not guaranteed to work. So what does it mean to provide insurance coverage to make infertility treatments accessible for people? What does it mean to just educate people about their fertility? For like, why don't we talk about fertility and more sex education, right? We're so worried about teaching young people about preventing pregnancy that we don't teach people basic information about their fertility, how it changes over their life course, what that looks like.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that we should go, be well, maybe. I mean, look, given what some policymakers are doing, I think baseline information about fertility and infertility treatments might serve us well in the long run. But that is also part of it, is helping make sure that people who want to be able to conceive have a level of knowledge and access to treatment and medical care that can serve them.
And affordability for that care.
Yeah, of course. I
Right.
mean, yeah, yeah. And I think
Speaking speaking of policymakers and the broken system, the deeply intertwined, all of the stuff you just talked about, when you did meet with some of these, moderate and then progressive leaning policymakers, are they open to taking this kind of thing on? Um, if there is something like caring for children without having to, plenary adoption, erase their identity, is there support for that? Like how do we go about getting that kind of support? It
Mhm.
seems like such a mountain to climb and
It does.
yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of opportunities, right? So when I talk to some California lawmakers, here in my home state about the original birth certificate access bill,
Which still, just so
which
listeners
California still doesn't
know.
have one, but they were
Yeah.
just like, wait, how do we not have, we don't have this?
No.
Why don't
And
we
and it
have
just
this?
got turned down again,
Why?
by the way.
Yeah,
I live in
yeah,
California.
yeah.
So,
And, but I think that, so 2 sessions ago, we had a really bad bill,
yeah.
right? And that was when I first started talking to some assembly members, and that bill got tanked, which was a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because that it was such a flawed bill. And that was some people were like, okay, yeah, I don't know anything about this. Like, let's have more of a conversation here. And so there was a better bill this session, didn't make it through, but at least the writing of the bill was better. Like, it would have been a bill that was worth passing, right? As opposed to the threat of having a bad bill pass,
Right.
right? So I think we are making progress, and people are willing to have that conversation because they are just realizing like, oh, we don't know anything about this, and we're being asked to legislate on that. So I am hopeful about that. For our federal lawmakers, who knows what's gonna our federal lawmakers are dealing with so much right now, and I'm not like saying that we should feel sorry for them. They signed up for this, and we should expect the best out of the people that we elect to represent us, but they're like, well, nothing is going to get out of committee anyway. So they're willing to learn. They want to have that conversation. There is a lot they don't know, and I think it doesn't take much of a conversation for them to realize how much they don't know. And just even offering up resources for people that they can talk with that aren't lobbying agencies or lobbying
Right.
for adoption agencies, I think is a meaningful alternative. So, I think that there is some like low-hanging fruit in changing the policy conversation and just educating people. I think there's opportunities. I'm not yet frustrated. I
Okay,
think we've been doing
good.
it long
That's
enough to
good to hear.
yeah, we
That's
haven't,
good.
I don't think we've made progress, but I
Yeah.
think that in order to make any progress, we have to shift the
Yeah.
conversation,
Mhm.
right? The first step is just education and is giving people tools for new ways to think about this, because our electeds are like steeped in the same cultural narratives that the rest of us
Right.
are.
Exactly.
That's
Right.
right.
And they have been told like adoption is good. So why wouldn't you subsidize it? Right. Why wouldn't we want to make adoption more accessible to everyone? That to them is the equity issue. And they don't have the context for what it actually looks like.
Yeah.
There's
And
resources.
these faith-based organizations are super powerful as well with their do-good narrative.
Yeah.
Hard to get past that.
And I will say it also like policymakers like things that they can agree on. Like, especially people who are in competitive districts, swing districts, who have to be accountable to both sides of the aisle as far as their voters. They like to be able to say, this is this bipartisan policy that I supported or I co-authored, and and it got support across the aisle, right? And so to ask left of center electeds to give up an area where they have always been able to find collegial common ground, like that's going to take work too. But the first step is just getting them to want to even challenge that in their own thinking. And that's where we are now.
And when you had something that I read about in researching you, that you said if you Googled young mother that needs help or something in
yeah.
California, the top 10 things that come up. So I did that here in California. And it was the top 5, 6 things that came up were adoption, like agencies. I'm probably going to start getting a flood of that, which is
So you'll
funny.
get
And
click on just a
but
few and they'll follow you.
that's going to
Yeah.
be great in my role. But that it's interesting you said that, because I do think this is where people get their information, is obviously TikTok, the internet, Instagram, quick bites, quick sound bites. So what do you think regular people can do? Like, we have a podcast about it, but is there some spaces we should be going in, or others can go? This is the challenge, that we don't really know the next level, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I think just continuing to have these conversations is really important, and pushing back on some of these ideas. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable to do
It is.
that, right? People in
Mhm.
my own life who are like, "Oh, we're thinking about adopting," and I just usually start with, "Well, why?" Right? Like, what, and like nobody ever asked people who went like, "Oh, wonderful, like you want
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
right?"
I know.
But it doesn't have to be confrontational, because again, I believe that most people come to this with good intentions, but misinformation.
And they're frustrated with
Um,
where they're at
yeah,
in their
yeah.
journey. Yeah.
And I think giving people and just saying like, "Oh, well, we don't really need more people to participate in the private adoption system. Like, we have really high demand. There are not babies out there in need of homes who don't have them within the private system. What does that look like? Like, what are you trying to accomplish?" Um, and I think that coming to a place where you can find shared values as much as possible is really important. And look, this is probably a space where it's easier for me that I am not directly impacted, right? That I'm not
Mhm. Right. That's
a mother,
kind of
that
what
I'm not an adoptee, because it's easy to just sort of have this like, it's less of an emotional
Mhm.
struggle.
That's right.
It is less personal for me in that way. I mean, obviously I have a lot of empathy for the women who share their stories with me. Like, I care deeply about them and, the tens of thousands of women out there like them every year. So I'm not detached from it, But I can have this conversation in maybe a more hypothetical space than a lot of adoptees can.
And might be taken, not be written off as, oh, you have an attachment to this
Right.
because you're an adoptee, because you're a birth mother, because,
That
any of
does
those
happen.
things.
Yeah.
You can be maybe listened to a little bit with a different ear than
Yeah.
we might be listened to.
Yes.
I mean,
Sadly,
unfortunately, yes, I
Yeah.
think that, but I say that I think you're right. But I also say that because like I want to acknowledge that it is easier for me to have some of these conversations that some adopted people are gonna be like, it's not my job to educate you, and it's not, right?
Mhm,
It's
right.
not your job to tackle this on. But I do think that if we want to see change in these areas, we also need to think about how we build coalition across
Yes.
other political conversations, right? So for me, coming from a frame of reproductive justice, the book that what I tried to answer in the book was like, how do we frame adoption as a reproductive justice issue, right? And other conversations about adoption as a children's rights issue, as a human rights issue, right? Like how do you take people who are engaged deeply in other work that holds justice at its core and help them understand how adoption relates to that?
Mhm.
Because that is how you're going to create change, is when people who aren't directly impacted see this as important to their work, right? People who work in anti-poverty and housing stability and all of these other pieces, when they see adoption as a relevant part of their conversation, that's when you're actually going to be able to create change.
It's good to know. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wrapping up, just how has writing this book affected you emotionally or creatively? Like,
Yeah.
where do you sit now with this?
Yeah.
Where do you go from here?
Well, it was interesting because there is like, if there's an author out there who doesn't read, I will say I've stopped reading them, but like within the first few weeks of the book came out, it's like you read your Amazon reviews, like the only feedback that you have, right? Like I've stopped now, but you do, and there was one that basically said that like I wrote this book in the service of a political agenda.
Oh,
And
Of course they did.
it's ironic to me because I didn't have a political agenda when I started this work, right? I didn't even have this framing until I did my 10-year follow-up necessarily. This is where the data took me, was to this lens.
That's
right?
why it's
Powerful.
important.
This
That's
is
why.
the argument. And that was why I wanted to include as much of the interview data in the book itself, because I think that that is the conclusion that you have to come to from reading these stories, right? And readers are smart. They know,
Yeah.
anyone who picks up this book is going to be ready for a deep conversation, right? And I think that is where it takes you. And I have always found, the stories of people who are impacted to be the most important to understanding this work and the advocacy and the political questions that come out of it most deeply. So, the book has been I've always been really clear too on like who I was writing this book for, right? First, I was writing the book for my participants, right? That's the first people that I was accountable to, and then their children, and then all other relinquishing mothers and parents and adopted people. Those were people that I most wanted the book to resonate with, and for it to feel like an accurate reflection to them and validating of their experiences. And then the rest of my audience was really for people left of center, again, who share values, who like believe in reproductive autonomy, who want to work toward a more ethical way of thinking about how we support families. Like there are plenty of people, not just anti-abortion people, but like people who are like, oh, well, poor people just shouldn't have families. Poor people just shouldn't have kids. And I'm like, okay, well, like we're not like, that's not a shared value that we have. And like, if that paradigm for understanding the world, like we're not going to come to a
We
shared
take it so for
value.
granted
Right.
that you can just,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's also like there would be moments where I was like, is this even that radical what I'm saying? Like, I'm just saying that like maybe parents want to raise their own children. Like, this seems pretty straightforward. And then you just have someone be like, poor people should never have kids if they can't afford them, you know, and have
Yes.
a fully stocked college fund before their first birthday. And I'm like, oh, right, that's the world we're operating in. And you can forget sometimes. You know, and so I wanted to write it for people who have a baseline shared understanding of what they want out of the world, but just haven't thought about how adoption relates, right? And so there's always going to be backlash from people that don't have that shared value system. And that's fine. Like, it's not, I didn't write the book for them. I hope they'll still read it. I think could still learn something.
Yeah.
But it's not, I don't feel like if they don't like it, that's fine. Not
I
for
feel
you.
like it's required reading.
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't have done
I'm going to
it.
be sharing it. We're both going to be
And
sharing
I will
Mhm.
say, I've taught, there's a couple of agencies that are assigning it to their prospective
Oh,
adoptive parents.
Good.
okay.
And I was at a big event last week and a woman came up, she's like, oh, I'm ordering your book because we are thinking about adopting. And I was like, okay, well, I'll be interested to hear what you think. And she's like, well, I
Let's
just
see if
really
you're going
feel
to
like I
adopt
have
after
to
you
read
read
it.
it.
Yeah. I was like, let's see. She's like, well, I have to read it before we adopt. And I was like,
Oh,
okay, well, like, let me know what you think, you know, and I think that there are those conversations.
those small changes are
And
important though, because
Mhm.
say they still continue to adopt, she will be more educated about it and look into things further, or maybe go into a different realm with this. Like, okay, we're not going to adopt, and what other
Maybe
options?
we'll be
Yes. Foster.
caregivers to children
That's
in
right.
need and foster until.
Right.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, for your diligent work with this book
Yes.
and getting the information out there and
And for
coming on
sending us a
podcasts and
signed copy.
oh, of
yes.
course. Yeah. No, and well, I know you have I'm always happy to share copies with adoptees.
Great.
I want adopted people to feel like they have access to this work. So I'm always happy to send copies if people want to message me.
Yeah. I think everyone's going to get a lot out of this interview. And we've had a lot of people writing us about following along with this. So this is a big one. So thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you both. Thank you for your careful reading. And I really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you.
Sorry for my dog bark.
He's saying goodbye on the interview.
Yes, he said goodbye. Thank you,
Thank you,
Gretchen,
Gretchen.
so much.
Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Take care.